Thank you very much to Christine and to Glenn for the very warm welcome. Thank you especially to all the students who I've had in my classes over the past few weeks for coming for our final lecture. It's been an absolute delight to have our conversations about economic policy and trade and the future for Europe. I'm also aware that I'm standing here today as an American, and it's not necessarily the most comfortable time in the world to be an American trying to advise Europeans on what you should do. But as I've been coming to the Institute to give my lectures over the weeks, every time I go to get my bus, I type into my Google Maps Avenue FD Roosevelt. And so as an American, makes me feel quite proud that one of our great presidents is so honored in this country. And I hope when you think of my country, you remember sort of the true American spirit embodied in people like Roosevelt. We hit money bumps in the road. This is another one. Hopefully, as we move forward, there is going to be a happier future for economic integration and certainly for more secure alliances. Okay, but so what I'd like to do today is go back in time a little bit and talk about where we've come with trade and then think a little bit about where we're going. And so this is a very standard, simple plot of data. This is the nominal value of total world merchandise trade from 1960 to 1923 in trillions of US dollars. It goes from 60 to 2023. What you can see is right around 1980, up until about 2007, there's a real exponential growth in nominal trade. So trade in this sort of 1980 post-inflation crisis period is just skyrocketing until we hit a series of bumps. And the bumps are first the global financial crisis of 2007, 2008. We see a sharp V, decline in nominal trade, then followed by a sort of plateauing flat period, which we've been calling the Great Trade Slowdown, until we hit the red vertical line is the beginning of the US-China trade war. Okay, and so again, you see an immediate slump, but also you see the COVID pandemic having a dent on trade, and then a nice sharp bouncing back. And so the question is, what has happened in the bigger picture here? That was just the nominal value of trade. What we might be more interested in is how much is trade changing relative to total economic activity. And so here we have some data from the WTO giving us imports and exports divided by 2, divided by GDP. So this is the trade to GDP ratio. And here what you see is between 95 and roughly 2007, an increase in this ratio from about 25% to 30%. But then again, here you see that this period of bumps is really kind of hiding a kind of rocky stagnation, where since 2007, the trade to GDP ratio is basically stopped, looks like it's settled. It's not clear where it's going. But one of the things this raises as a question is, why have we seen this sort of sudden stop or slowdown? And for our purposes today, with the increased what looks like fragmentation of policy, a question is, how important is policy in driving trade and the growth of trade? Okay, and a big question we want to ask is more market fragmentation inevitable? Are we in a period of sort of low or steady trade growth, or kind of stagnant trade growth as a share of GDP? And the policy environment is not looking good. Okay, so we obviously have trade war 2.0. Back in, before the election in October, Donald Trump is telling us that tariff is the most beautiful word in the dictionary. Thought there might have been some other ones, like beauty might have been the most beautiful word. But and then we also have the incredibly prescient Anna Swanson writing for the New York Times before the election, saying, Trump's vast tariffs would rock global business and shake alliances. And the sentence below says that Trump's return is going to be a grenade thrown in the heart of the international trading system. I think a grenade now looks like a quite modest statement, and it looks much more like a torpedo or a nuclear bomb has befallen the system. But even if you'd asked me a year ago, I wasn't only worried about Trump when we think about trade fragmentation and the breakdown of international cooperation. We can also look even, to be critical to Europe. And so here we have just, at the same time that Anna Swanson is saying Trump is going to start a trade war, we see a different approach to policy, but in some sense the same policy of Europe saying that they're going to stop importing electric vehicles from China at a low tariff rate, and they're going to be posing anti-dumping and countervailing duties on Chinese vehicles. And so the prior year, when Ursula von der Leyen addressed the European Parliament, she said, from wind to steel, from batteries to electric vehicles, our ambition is crystal clear. The future of our clean tech industry has to be made in Europe. Describing global markets are now flooded with cheaper Chinese cars, and their price is kept artificially low by huge state subsidies. This is not just to pick on Europe. One can also look back at Joe Biden's Inflation Reduction Act and the huge subsidies that the US was offering to electric vehicles made in America and its free trade agreement partners, and see this is another symptom of trade fragmentation. And most recently, we have a sort of assessment by a Brussels resident, Alan Beattie, writing in Blue Sky Social about before Trump is actually signed into office in early January. Apparently, the Washington Post has published a story saying, oh, he might be talking like there's going to be high tariffs, but we think he'll negotiate down, something like that. And Alan Beattie is coming back and saying, look, you can try to do all the crystal ball gazing you'd like. The reality is with Trump, nobody knows anything. And I would say, well, actually saying nobody knows anything tells us we actually know as economists quite a bit, because one thing that economists love to study is uncertainty. And we have a wealth of information about how private sector agents operating in trade respond to policy uncertainty. And so just to point out a few facts from the prior literature, at the time of the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989, the US Congress instituted some new laws saying that because China wasn't a WTO member, if at any point the US Congress felt that China was not respecting human rights, they reserved the right to raise tariffs on China. And this policy was in place until China joined the WTO. So every year, China was subject to an annual review of its human rights policies, and this created some uncertainty about how much market access China would have. And so once China became a WTO member, the US Congress, in a sense, lost the discretion to impose this sort of human rights-linked tariff policy. And we have studies showing, for example, Handley and Lamau, that 1/3 of the export growth of Chinese export value to the US between 2000 and 2005 was due to the greater policy certainty associated with China's WTO accession. I have some work with some Chinese co-authors saying that 40% of the new exporters from China that entered the market over 2000 to 2009, that entry was because of certainty over future tariff policy under the auspices of the WTO. And it's not just that it induces more trade, but on the investment side, once foreign investors understood that China would have access to markets on sort of a continual basis in the United States, you saw inward investment developing industries in China to the point that between 2000 and 2014, roughly half of the export value originating from Chinese firms was originating in foreign invested enterprises. So enterprises from Taiwan, Hong Kong, the US, the European Union, Japan and Korea that were investing in Chinese firms. So a lot of the concern that's been raised over Chinese trade over the years is, America importing stuff made in Samsung factories in China, right? So it's a bit more complicated, but the certainty was one of the factors, I think, driving the investment into China by foreign parties. And the other thing we know is, even today, new investment responds to uncertainty. Okay, and there's been considerable uncertainty and risk in terms of supply chains for semiconductors, and this is some information taken from Intel's webpage, where their 10 largest construction projects last year were in the USA, Ireland, Israel, Germany, Malaysia, and Poland. Okay, and so the photo is of an Intel foundry in construction in New Mexico. The map, you'll see all the locations of Intel foundries around the world. The notable ones, the ones with the stars in white in the middle of the bubble, one is in Ohio. That's a foundry under development in J.D. Vance's home state. And then the other two starred bubbles in the middle of Europe are the ones in Germany and Poland. So if you are uncertain about how well you can access your supply, there's an incentive to invest. And also in the case of Europe, we have support under the CHIPS Act, helping facilitate that. Now, where we are today, the question I'd like us to think about as economists and as policymakers is there's been an extensive amount of research over the last 20 years, especially looking at firms' engagement in the global economy. And the question is, how should that research on the engagement of firms in the global economy inform our policy analysis, our policy design, and how we manage or potentially try to prevent the breakdown of the post-World War II multilateral trading system. Okay, and so knowing that many of us are not economic specialists, I'll just go through and give you a brief history of how the literature and our understanding of the economy and international trade has grown. So our starting point can be 1979, when Paul Krugman introduces a revolutionary idea in trade that is, there are gains to trade when two economies are populated by firms that have sort of two important characteristics. They have a high fixed cost of production and a low variable cost of producing units of output. That feature, which is sort of the normal feature of firms in everything from aircraft to semiconductors to autos, combined with a population in these countries of workers who like variety in what they consume. People don't all just want to wear a gray sweater. They like blue sweaters and red sweaters and lots of variety. Those two features generate economic models in which there can be gains from trade. And this is quite revolutionary because the prior understanding in classical trade was gains only came from technology differences. It was extremely important because the big puzzle at the time was why on earth is the US trading with Britain and Germany, because these are economies with the same technology, the same educated population, roughly the same incomes. It didn't make a lot of sense. So Krugman gives us this new framework, which in many ways continues to dominate a lot of our thinking about trade today. After he introduces this framework, throughout the 80s and 90s, there's a wealth of research that, again, following some of the developments in policy, but also new developments in industrial organization, a lot of study of international trade was focused on oligopolistic models with imperfect competition. And so there are contributions from people including Krugman, Eleanor Heltman, Gene Grossman, John Eaton, Barbara Spencer, and Jim Brander, basically looking at strategic trade policy, imperfect competition. And the idea behind all these models is that there are rents and profits to be made. And firms want to make big rents. They need these rents to innovate. Governments want their firms to make these profits because this wealth can be, distributed within a society. And so governments, the whole idea, can use policy to steal these rents and steal these markets from one another. Okay, and so that's the sort of focus of the literature. But as we go forward in time, when we reach 2003, we have another sort of revolutionary model. And this is Mark Mellitz finally figures out the math to help us understand how to develop a more general model of Paul Krugman's original idea. And the big thing we'd struggled with was how do we develop models in which we have firms that aren't exactly the same. And so he introduces new features where firms differ in their production costs, and this helps us explain a lot of puzzles we have in the economy, Why is it that when we have trade liberalizations, the entire economies grow in their aggregate productivity? So this, combined with advanced computing power and the greater availability of administrative data sets from governments around the world, leads to a vast literature studying the contribution of firms and giving us lots of new insights into how firms price, how they sell things, where they participate, how they respond to exchange rates. But then, we always like to look at things very critically. Following upon that, we have a couple of studies that say, okay, well, we understand exactly what's going on in all of these models, but we have Kostas Arkalakis, Costano, Rodriguez-Clare go through and they look at a battery of all of these different models, and they say, well, you know what? At the end of the day, many, many different economic modeling structures have one thing in common. They all deliver very small gains from trade. And this is a bit of a puzzle, but whenever we do our models and we try to study these counterfactuals, we have all these facts, but it's very hard to show that there are real welfare benefits and humans really are benefit from trade. In a follow-up study, they go a little bit further and they say, okay, well, one of the things people say is that a benefit of trade is that when you liberalize a market and open it to foreigners, you introduce more competition into a market, and that intensified competition should bring down price-cost markups and generate additional benefits known as the pro-competitive benefit of trade. Okay? But again, they say, well, we look at a wide class of models and we don't find very big benefits. In case of pro-competitive benefits, they say, well, there's some pro-competitive benefits within a country, but on the export side, they're offset by rising market power, so it's all a bit of a wash. So this leaves us with the puzzle of like, well, wait a second. If trade delivers so little in benefits to humans, why do we have so many policymakers and business people trying so hard to integrate markets and expand trade? And so the question is sort of one for economic analysis, which is crucial to think about proper policy design, is what are we missing in how we're doing this? Okay. And so I'll go back and I'll focus in on this point about pro-competitive gains and the price-cost markups of exporting firms. And the key point in a large number of studies, and here I'm only citing a few, is that firms that operate globally hold market power and they exploit this market power in their pricing to make themselves as profitable as possible. That's exactly what they should do. This is not like a moral judgment that they're exploiting market power. That's what the objective of a firm is, and that's an obligation they have to their shareholders. But just to say, there's a large literature in international macro that says we have evidence of exchange rate disconnect pricing to market, and that larger, more productive firms adjust markups more in response to exchange rate changes. So the key thing here is these firms set different prices in different markets when they have different levels of market power. I have a number of studies with different teams of co-authors where we study the United Kingdom, we study China, and we also study, I'll tell you more about it in a few minutes, 11 low and middle income countries to try to understand how do these firms price? Do they set different prices in different markets? Do they change their prices when their market power changes? And what we see is that they're more likely to exploit market power when they're exporting highly differentiated goods, when they're exporting final consumer goods like cars rather than parts like, spark plugs. They're also more likely to exploit this market power when these are goods exported by foreign invested firms, in the case of China. So think highly capitalized firms might be using more innovative technology, as well as in the case of the UK, when firms export goods and they price them in the local currency of a foreign country. So think British firms exporting to Canada, pricing in Canadian dollars. And the key thing, the one I've highlighted in red here, is we also observe that a firm's price-cost markup declines when it is exporting to a country with whom its own country signs a free trade agreement or cuts a tariff. And what we observe is that a tariff cut, for example, of the US on Mexico, stimulates entry by additional Mexican firms into the US market. And this stimulation of additional Mexican firms going into the US market causes intense competition among Mexican firms reaching the US, so much so that the price-cost markups of the firms that had always been exporting from Mexico to the US come down. So it's the competitive pressure brings additional gains. Okay? And so then the question becomes, well, should economists rethink which models we're using to analyze trade policy and trade policy analysis? And if we're observing big reductions in price-cost markups, that suggests we might be in a world where there's far less competition among firms initially, and there is greater scope for more competition induced by trade policy to bring bigger benefits to people. Okay? And so I'm now going to show you, in my research, I have sort of two entirely different paths I'm walking to try to understand this phenomenon better. And so I'll first start out and say we can go down what's known as sort of the I/O route. So we can take a case study, look at one narrowly defined industry about which we can learn a lot of information, and try to understand the pricing behavior just within that narrowly defined industry, and think about how can different features that inhibit or facilitate trade in that industry change firm pricing and ultimately consumer welfare. And so in this paper, I'm happy to be a co-author with a Belgian, Joris Host, and the paper we have is called In Hot Water, Clarifying British Prices in the Wake of Brexit. And the key thing here is our economic understanding of barriers to trade that arise from sort of not explicit policies, but issues related to policy in markets such as transportation, distribution, and retail remains very poor. And so there's a lot of scope for us to understand how these auxiliary markets affect trade. Okay, so what we do is we're going to analyze the bottled water industry. The idea here is we want to understand how Brexit-induced changes in non-trade policy barriers, such as transportation, affected the prices that British consumers pay. And so we're going to look specifically at one non-trade policy barrier, which is increases in freight rates between European Union and Britain. Now, why do we study bottled water? You might think it's not a very important part of the economy. Well, the nice thing about bottled water is it has a very simple value chain of production. You have a spring and a source. You put water in a bottle. You put it on a truck. You send the truck to a store. And then a person comes in and buys the water. That's it. There's no part supply. And the other thing importantly about bottled water is in most industries, if you change a trade barrier, this changes all the incentives from the firm around where should they produce. And so if we think about a different beverage like Coca-Cola, if there's a big barrier between Britain and France, you're not going to want to import Coca-Cola from France. It might turn out to be just much cheaper to just expand production of Coca-Cola in Britain. But you can't expand production of Evian in Britain because there's only one Evian. So we have to, and in EU regulations, we know exactly where every bottle of water sold in the EU is labeled with its source and its origin. So our focus here is going to be on the transportation sector. It wasn't our original focus. We had some ideas that transportation would be important, but the key thing was we were interested in how regulatory changes could potentially make transportation slower or more expensive. Okay. So what do we do and what do we find? Well, overall, the effect of Brexit on consumer prices, our question is how did British prices of bottled water change relative to prices of the same goods in Belgium and France? And the key thing we find is that after the institution of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, British prices rise 17% relative to products sold in Belgium and France. Why is this happening? Well, we also observe that the price of getting a bottle of water from most routes in Europe to routes within the United Kingdom go up by about 850 euro on a base price of a shipment of around 2,000 to 3,000 euros. This is quite sizable. And the last thing we do is we use an industrial organization model to try to quantify the importance of this freight rate increase onto the costs of producing the bottled water so that we can understand both how did the price change, but also how did firms change their priced cost markup, right? Because we also want to understand the interaction. So where is water that is consumed in Europe and Britain produced? You can see in the left-hand panel these colored dots in the size. These are the volume of production of water sources all across Europe, serving all of these countries in Europe. In this panel here, the darkened bubbles are the volume of the source providing water to the United Kingdom, okay? And so what you can see here is, most of the water that people drink from bottles in the UK comes from UK sources, but they seem to like Evian, Volvic, San Pellegrino. So you see a bit of that. People who aren't very big fans of bottled water or a bit more environmental might think this is a bit of a waste, but we have a free market. People can choose the things they like. The first thing we want to do, and I'll just jump to the picture, is the first thing we want to understand is how did the price facing British consumers change relative to the price facing Belgian or French consumers? And what this graph shows you is from, this is January 2016 here. This is going to be June 2016 when the referendum vote is made. There's a whole series of additional changes as the British try to figure out what on earth they want to do. But the actual trade and cooperation agreement comes into force in January 2021. And from my perspective, this is quite surprising because we see basically that the difference, so this is looking at the zero indicates there's a fixed level difference between the price of a bottle of water in Britain versus France. But we difference that out, so we subtract that. And so we're saying that a difference around zero means there's sort of a fixed level difference between the British price and the French price that's bobbling along. But what we don't really see is any big deviations from zero until after January 2021, and we see this sharp increase in the price in Britain relative to the other countries. Now, this could be caused by lots of different things. We can potentially do an experiment, and instead we could say, well, let's look at how the price of Belgian water evolves over the same period of time relative to the price of bottled water in France. And so in this second graph, this is giving you the difference of Evian consumed in Belgium versus Evian consumed in France. And what you see here is it's not that anything has happened to French bottled water producers going to foreign countries. There's no change here. All of the change is very specifically happening within the UK. Then the question becomes, well, why is this happening? We can also do a similar type of analysis to understand how freight routes are changing. And so here what we have is the difference between the price of a route going from Evian to, say, Toulouse versus the price for shipping a lorry full of water from Evian to Manchester. And so what you can see is the data starts for us in January 2018 because that's when the firm that provides the data is incorporated. But prior to the actual implementation of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, there's a difference between going to any destination in France versus any destination in Europe. But once we've differenced that out, it pretty much is flat over this whole early period. It's only once the Trade and Cooperation Agreement kicks in that we see this big increase in the rate of freight to get into Britain, okay? And this is a huge increase, about 30% of the cost of filling a lorry load of water. So what's going on here? The key mechanism and the key thing that's changing is before Britain leaves the European Union formally, lorry drivers from within the European Union can drop off a lorry load full of water in Manchester and then pick up a lorry load full of spark plugs, which they can then drive on to Edinburgh. And then they can pick up a lorry load full of fish, and they can deliver it to Heathrow Airport. And they can stay within the UK for a number of trips, but after Brexit, they're limited to just 2 locations. And this is where we see European-based drivers are unwilling to take goods into Britain unless they get a premium, because they're all presumably worried about being left out of pocket when their 2 trips are exhausted and they're in Edinburgh with an empty lorry and a big gas bill to get back across the English Channel. Okay, so the other thing I'll say is, and we can compare this again in studying, this is very much a specific British effect. We can see that if we look at routes to get to Belgium, it's perfectly flat. Now, with this information in hand, we can then go and reverse engineer how much of this increase in the cost is feeding through to a total change in the price of providing water to Britain, and then also how this is changing the price. And in the interest of time, I'll just tell you, it's not just the imported water price that's changing. As the price of Evian goes up 17%, we also see the price of British varieties, such as Highland Springs and Buxton, going up 17%. Not only that, but over the same period after the Trade and Cooperation Agreement comes online, we see an increase in the cost of serving of freight rates internally within the British market. Again, those European drivers who'd been providing transportation services in Britain are now removed, causing the price of all freight to go up in Britain. And so in terms of the price increase we see, it's a combination of an increase in the cost, but apparently on both the foreign European varieties of water and the domestic British varieties of water, everyone saw this price increase and used it as an opportunity to, when the price went up, also raise their markups. And so firms were exploiting their power, and so we see that the net result of this trade disintegration episode that had no increases in tariffs, no increases in regulations of bottled water, led to a cost increase in transportation that fed into a price increase for consumers that was bigger than the cost increase. So we call this an anti-competitive price increase. It's about firms exploiting their market power. So this suggests that if we want to understand the real costs of disintegration, we really have to think about how the market structure is changing, and is it becoming less competitive? Because that means that the costs, as terrible as they might be estimated to be, are actually a good deal worse than we thought. Okay? And so the end result, I'll just say, to summarize, the increase in freight rates explained about 25 to 30% of the total increase in the cost of providing foreign varieties of bottled water from France or Belgium into Britain, but it also led to an increase in the markups that both French, Belgian, and British varieties were all charging consumers. Okay, so the next thing, I have until 10 minutes more. So the next thing I want to tell you about very quickly is how do changes in market structure or market integration impact market structure, the market power of exporters, and welfare. And so here I'm taking a completely different approach, and here I'm using a multi-country, multi-sector model where we're going to be using a lot of computer power to try to understand how firms are exploiting their market power and how changes in policy can lead to greater profitability, but also collusion on the part of exporters. So the data set here consists of the universe of trade transactions for 11 low and middle income countries over a period, for most of them, it's about 2000 to 2013. But this is every firm and every 6-digit commodity they're exporting. So a 6-digit commodity is something like a woman's shirt or a boy's t-shirt. And the biggest economies in the data set are China, Mexico, and Egypt. Okay, but we have the other smaller ones are also giving some useful information. And we combine this data with the import tariffs in 165 destinations these countries reach. That's pretty much most of the big consumption places in the world, so we're leaving out very, very small places. And these are countries that report their MFN, or most favored nation tariff, as well as any special preferences, preferential trade agreement tariffs to the WTO. The first fact is that for these 11 countries, their exports are much more concentrated than I think many economists understood previously. And so in these 165 destinations, if we define a product market as a 6-digit good, such as a woman's polyester shirt, what we find is conditional on at least one firm from your country reaching that foreign destination, so one of these 165 destination markets, the median number of firms that are reaching that foreign market is only 3. For the US, it's only 7. So we're talking about, for all of these products, there are very few firms that ever export from one origin to a final destination. Now, for a big market like the US, you could have 3 firms from France, 3 firms from Spain, 3 firms from Mexico, 3 firms from China, but it's still much more concentrated than we realized. And not only are there very few firms, but they're changing whether they participate in markets a lot, and conditional on there being at least one firm in that country, so one Mexican firm exporting, say, leather shoes to the United States last year, the bottom panel will say if there's at least one incumbent that was available last year and one new entrant, so a new Mexican firm entering the US to sell leather shoes, the average incumbent has about 2/3 of the market, 60%, and the average entrant is taking about 30%. So this means the new entrant from Mexico into the US is taking 30% of the Mexican total market of shoes going from Mexico to the US. Okay, so it's not the whole US market, but this suggests that firms, that there's so few of them, there's only 3, they're much more likely to be competing oligopolistically than competitively, okay? It's also saying that every time a firm enters or exits, it can have a big impact on the market structure because it's taking or giving away 30% of a market potentially. Now, in terms of analysis, we look at, for these firms, we look at a firm selling its product from its origin, Mexico, to a destination like the United States, and we look at how these firms change their sales in response to changes in MFN tariffs, which is going to be the number highlighted in red, versus a bilateral or preferential tariff in blue. The fact that these two numbers are different tells us that a firm cares about whether a change that it's facing is only available to firms in its country. It's much more responsive when it has a change, a 10% tariff change that only affects Mexican firms, than it is if the US has a wide multilateral change for the same good affecting all firms. So this again suggests that the market is much more oligopolistic and characterized by limited competition. Further, we can see that when firms enter these markets in response to a tariff cut, they lower the price-cost markup they charge. So the blue number, 0.23, indicates in response to a tariff cut by a country like the US, Mexican firms that are selling to the US cut their price-cost markups. Okay, so jumping ahead, this leads us to an idea that relative to sort of the research of Krugman or Melitz, those models have an aspect of sort of what we call monopolistic competition, but firms have very little scope for getting rents or sort of supernormal profits, whereas here the data is pointing to firms having an opportunity to get profits, to steal profits from other firms. And so what we want to do is build a model that can capture these micro market structure features, match the observable data we have, and then use this to evaluate the price and welfare changes associated with the trade war. Okay, I'll very briefly describe this in words, so no worries if you're not an economist. The few economists in the room will maybe understand what's going on here. But the idea is that the competitive structure we have is that Mexican firms selling shoes in a foreign market like the United States are going to be competing very intensely with other firms from Mexico that sell shoes. And this kind of, we have intense competition across firms within an origin. At the next level, while Mexican shoes might be substitutable with varieties from China or Germany, they're not quite as good substitutes with one another. So pressure and competitive pressures that would come from the substitutability of Chinese versus Mexican shoes is a little bit less. And at the highest level of aggregation, different goods in an economy, you spend money on shoes, you spend money on sneakers, you spend money on clothes, that's less substitutable. This is a way to build a tractable, what we call oligopolistic structure. And we can use this to try to simulate what would happen if we have a world economy with 4 countries, 1,000 products, and a variable number of firms that can enter into each one of these markets. So the number of firms that can enter could be 2 or could be 5. And so in an equilibrium, firms will enter as long as they can make profits. But because there's limited competition and there's high cost of entry, the entry of just one more firm associated with a reduction in tariffs will cause the existing firms to lose profits because they will have to bring down their price cost markups. So this is a model in which there are economic rents to be had, okay? And we're gonna compare our model with economic rents, which are the models sort of 2 and 4 in red, with previous models introduced by Krugman and Melitz. Okay, and I'll skip ahead here. Our baseline model that we think is sort of the most realistic one is the one indicated in red. And so what this picture shows you is as we change how substitutable different products are with one another, on the vertical axis we have the price change associated in trade war countries when they impose tariffs going from 10 to 20%. How much do their domestic prices change as a result of the tariff increase? And the comparison here is between the solid red line and the dashed red line. What you can see, 2.5 versus 1, is telling you that the price impacts of a trade war in this type of oligopolistic economy are about 2.5 times as big as they would be in a standard monopolistic competition model of the type that we have with the Paul Krugman model or the Mark Melitz model. This price increase translates into, again, we can compare the dotted red line with the solid red line to reductions in welfare that are here about 4 times as large, okay? So the idea here is once you have firms with market power, if you engage in a trade war, the consequences for consumer welfare are going to be much, much more negative. And so this is alarming today if we think about the world we're in. If our trade models weren't working properly, and this is a better model, it suggests everything we're going to face is going to be a bit worse. We can break the effect of the trade war down into different components. In this graph, the 2 trade war economies are going to have losses of welfare. The first column shows us how big the loss in welfare is going to be in total. The second dark gray block is showing you the comparison if you had one of this Melitz or Krugman style models. The difference can be explained by 2 features that you get in the new model of oligopolistic competition. The first welfare loss comes from when you put on these tariffs, you're going to have a lot of varieties exiting a market. So the tariff here is associated with a big decline in welfare, captured in red, that's associated with firms exiting the markets. Each firm that leaves itself is causing some welfare loss. The second component is important because I think this is the component that Donald Trump believes exists, and believes will be very large. So the blue component is, as you raise domestic prices when you engage in a trade war, somebody's making money. Who's making money? Domestic firms. Most models won't capture the magnitude of this, but in our oligopolistic competition model, if you raise the tariff on Mexico, Mexican firms leave the market. This gives American firms much more market power to raise the price. The profits, the increased profits of the American firms are sort of an offsetting welfare gain that offsets this sort of loss from variety. Okay, so I'm running long and I know the hour is late. So just to summarize the entire agenda here, the main point is that once we introduce an oligopolistic type structure, we're ultimately going to find that the entry and exit of firms in response to trade barriers is going to be very significant and lead us to price and welfare impacts that are roughly 2 to 3 times as large as other types of approaches. And then more generally, just to say, to summarize this research agenda on trade policy and market integration, we have a long literature from International Macro that's emphasized the importance of market power as a source of long and persistent price differences across markets. Here, what I've tried to argue for you is that trade agreements impact market structure both through the auxiliary markets that they try to create. In this case, it would be in the European Union, the market for transportation. They also facilitate more intense competition by lowering barriers to entry for exporters. And so this general agenda shows that the benefits of trade agreements are larger once we take into account oligopolistic structure, once we take into account the fact that trade agreements don't just affect goods, but they also can affect the auxiliary markets that support trade in those goods. Going ahead, there's a lot to be worried about. It seems that under President Trump's presidency, we're almost certainly going to see a greater fragmentation of the global economy. I would have said 6 months ago that I thought the direction of fragmentation was going to be the world would split into 2 spheres, one a democracy sphere, one an autocracy sphere, and then one a kind of third sphere of countries left out of both. Today, the emergence of the democracy sphere seems less certain as Trump really seems to be pursuing a unilateral policy against everyone. Potentially, there's the scope for the European Union to continue to have free trade with other countries. Although on a more hopeful note, I would say that, especially for the young people who are at the start of their career and thinking about how are they going to try to build a better world, human beings are amazingly innovative at many, many different things. While a lot of recent research has emphasized the costs of global fragmentation, there's still some capacity here. If the market size available to Europe and other Western democracies remains large, a study by Ralph Ossa says the cost of trade wars might not be so high. So if you have, so the sort of issue is if you have, 500 million, 700 million people in a large integrated economy, closing barriers to another billion isn't really going to have a huge impact. The scale of the economy, if that 700 million remains quite integrated, there's actually a lot of scope for gains. And so the research here kind of highlights that even though we may be in a period where policy barriers to trade, at least with the US, it's almost inevitable, there are other avenues down which market integration can proceed. And so just thinking about the transportation barriers and the cost that's created for the United Kingdom highlights for policymakers that there are avenues that you can pursue, and in many cases unilaterally. The British could fix their transportation problem on their own. They don't really need European permission to allow foreigners to operate in their market. So there's scope. So with that, I'll conclude and thank everyone for being so patient.